Before the marble ruins were white, they were painted in vibrant colors, just as the story of the man who walked among them was painted in complexity and contradiction. He was the ugliest man in Athens, yet he possessed a mind of such terrifying beauty that it seduced the youth and terrified the tyrants. He never wrote a single word, yet his voice echoes through 24 centuries of human thought. He was a soldier, a stone cutter, and a martyr who drank poison as if it were wine. This is not just the story of a philosopher. It is the story of the man who taught the world how to question, and in doing so signed his own death warrant. The sun over Attica is not merely a source of light. It is a weight, a golden pressure that flattens the landscape and bakes the earth into a hard, unyielding crust. In the mid-5th century before the Common Era, this sun shone down upon a city that was rapidly becoming the center of the world. Athens was not yet the city of white ghosts and broken columns that history remembers. It was a sensory explosion of noise, color, and ambition. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, roasting meats, and the briny sharp tang of the Aegean Sea carried on the southern wind. It was in the district of Alapis, just outside the city walls, where the dust of the road mingled with the dust of the stone quarries, that a child was born who would crack the foundations of this city more thoroughly than any earthquake. Socrates arrived in a world of stone and flesh. His father, Socrates, was a sculptor, a man who spent his days imposing his will upon marble, chipping away the excess to reveal the form hidden within. His mother, Narrated, was a midwife, a woman whose hands knew the blood and slickness of bringing new life into the existence. These two professions, the cutting of stone and the delivering of life, would become the unseen architects of Socrates' own destiny. He would grow up to claim that he followed in both their footsteps, though he would hold neither a chisel nor a towel. He would shape souls by chipping away at their ignorance, and he would act as a midwife to the truth, delivering ideas that were struggling to be born within the minds of men. As a child and a young man, there was little to distinguish him as a future giant of intellect. In a culture that worshipped physical beauty, equating the perfection of the body with the perfection of the soul, Socrates was an anomaly. He was startlingly ugly by the standards of the Greeks. He had a broad, flat face, a snub nose with wide, flaring nostrils, and eyes that bulged prominently, set too far apart. His lips were thick and framed a mouth that was often set in a bemused expression. He looked less like a statue of Apollo and more like a satyr, or a Silenus figure, those wild, half-beast companions of Dionysus. Yet, beneath this rough, clay-like exterior lay a constitution of iron. He was robust, stocky, and possessed of a physical endurance that would later become the stuff of legend in the military camps of Potidæa and Delium. He walked the streets of a city that was drunk on its own power. Athens under Pericles was a marvel of democracy and empire. The Parthenon was rising on the Acropolis, a testament to human greatness and divine favor. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was already present in the city, imported by travelers and sages who spoke of the elements, of water, fire, and atoms. But these men looked at the stars, trying to understand the mechanics of the cosmos. Socrates, in his youth, looked at the earth. He looked at the people. He wandered through the gymnasium and the marketplace, observing the rituals of daily life, the transactions of merchants, the boasts of politicians, and the prayers of priests. He listened. In a city where everyone rushed to speak, to orate, to convince, he was a silent void, absorbing the chaotic energy of the polis. There was a restlessness in him, a sense that the surface of things was a deception. While his father taught him to smooth the rough edges of a stone block, Socrates began to wonder about the rough edges of human definition. What made a man just? What made a city good? These questions were not yet formed into a method. They were merely a hum in the back of his mind, a dissonance that grew louder as he matured. He studied the natural philosophers, reading the scrolls of Anaxagoras, learning about mind as the ordering force of the universe, but he found them wanting. They explained how things happened, how air compressed to form clouds, how stones fell. But they could not explain why things were as they were or what was the best way for a human being to live. The turning point, the moment that severed him from the ordinary trajectory of an Athenian citizen, came not from a book, nor from a teacher, but from a journey undertaken by a friend. Chaerephon, a man of impetuous nature and intense devotion, traveled to the navel of the world, Delphi. The journey to the sanctuary of Apollo was a pilgrimage through rugged mountains, ascending into the thinning air where the eagles circled. Delphi was the place where the divine intersected with the mortal, where the vapors rising from the chasm in the earth granted the Pythia, the high priestess, the power to see what remained hidden to men. The sanctuary was a place of awe, filled with the treasuries of city-states, statues of gold and bronze, and the heavy silence of anticipation. Chaerephon, driven by a burning curiosity and perhaps a naivety that only a true friend possesses, approached the oracle. He did not ask about the outcome of a war, or the success of a harvest, or the curing of a plague. He asked a question that was startling in its simplicity and dangerous in its implications. He asked if there was anyone living who was wiser than Socrates, the son of Sophroniscus. The Pythia, seated upon her tripod, veiled in smoke, slipping into that trance where the god speaks through human vocal cords, gave the answer. The voice that emerged was not her own. It was the voice of Apollo, absolute and terrifying. The answer was brief, as the oracles always were. No one is wiser. When Chaerephon returned to Athens, dusty and exhausted, and delivered this news to Socrates, the reaction was not pride. It was not joy. It was a profound, destabilizing confusion. Socrates, standing perhaps in the shadow of a workshop or under the shade of a plane tree, felt the weight of the god's words settle upon him like a heavy yoke. He knew himself. He searched his own mind, scanning the corridors of his thoughts, and found nothing that resembled wisdom. He knew no great truths about the cosmos. He possessed no technical skill that could rival the craftsman. He had no silver-tongued rhetoric like the sophists who sold wisdom for a fee. He was painfully, acutely aware of his own ignorance. This created a theological paradox that threatened to tear his world apart. The god cannot lie. Apollo is the god of truth and light. Yet Socrates knew he was not wise. If the god says he is the wisest, and he knows nothing, then there is a riddle here that demands to be solved. A lesser man might have accepted the compliment and become arrogant. A pious man might have accepted it as a mystery beyond understanding. Socrates did neither. He decided to test the oracle. He decided to investigate the meaning of the god by finding a man wiser than himself. If he could find just one man who knew what was truly good and noble, he could go to Delphi and say to the god, "Look, this man is wiser than I, yet you said I was the wisest." It was an act of pious impiety. He began his search among the politicians, the men who guided the ship of state, who claimed to know justice and the laws. He went to them not as a teacher but as a student asking humble questions. He asked them to define the virtues they claimed to possess. And in those early conversations, under the bright Athenian sun, the tragedy began to unfold. He found that these men, who were held in high esteem by the city and even higher, esteem by themselves, knew nothing. They spoke in platitudes, in vague contradictions, crumbling under the gentle pressure of his questions. When he tried to show them that they were not wise, they did not thank him for the revelation. They hated him for it. He moved to the poets, the tragedians who wrote the words that made the city weep and cheer. He asked them to explain the meaning of their own beautiful passages. He found that they wrote not by wisdom, but by some form of instinct or inspiration, like seers or soothsayers who say many fine things but understand nothing of what they say. Finally, he turned to the craftsmen, the artisans. Here, at least, he found knowledge. They knew how to make shoes, how to forge armor, how to build temples. They possessed a specific wisdom he lacked. But because they were masters of their trade, They believed they were also masters of the highest matters of human life, politics, virtue, and the good. This error obscured the knowledge they did possess. Slowly, the meaning of the oracle began to dawn on him, settling in his soul with the clarity of a geometric proof. The prophecy was not a glorification of Socrates. It was a condemnation of human arrogance. The god was using Socrates as an example, as if to say to the people of Athens, "He, O men, is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing." This realization did not bring him peace. It brought him a mission. He was not merely a philosopher. He was a servant of the god, commanded to roam the city, to accost its citizens, to strip away their pretensions, and to show them the poverty of their own minds so that they might begin to seek true wealth. He became a hunter of souls, stalking the marketplaces and the gymnasiums, driven by a divine mandate that would eventually put him on a collision course with the state itself. The whisper of Delphi had become a roar in his blood, and the son of the midwife prepared himself to deliver a city from the womb of its own ignorance, regardless of the pain such a birth would cause. To understand the mind that would dismantle the assumptions of Athens, one must first look at the body that carried it. History remembers Socrates as an old man, balding and paunchy, sitting on stone steps. But before the beard turned gray, the flesh was hard muscle, tempered in the forge of the phalanx. The philosopher was a hoplite. He was a man of the shield and spear, a citizen soldier who stood in the shield wall where the crushing weight of bronze and the smell of fear were the only realities. The backdrop was the long, grinding prelude to the Peloponnesian War. Athens, the tyrant city, demanded tribute from her allies, and Potidaea had rebelled. The Athenian army marched north, far from the olive groves and the warm limestone of Attica, into the harsh, biting winters of Thrace. It was here, in the misery of a siege, that the peculiar character of Socrates began to manifest, not through words, but through an endurance that bordered on the supernatural. The winter at Potidaea was brutal. The ground froze as hard as iron, and the wind whipped off the sea with a ferocity that cut through the thickest wool. The other soldiers, men of good breeding and soft living, wrapped themselves in layers of felt and sheepskin. They bound their feet in heavy wrappings, cursing the cold, huddling around fires that hissed and sputtered in the damp air. Amidst this shivering army walked Socrates. He wore the same thin, threadbare cloak he wore in the heat of summer. On his feet he wore nothing. He marched barefoot over the ice and the sharp, frozen mud with a casual indifference that infuriated his comrades. They looked at his bare feet, pink with cold but unblistered, and felt mocked. They thought he was showing off, displaying a hubristic toughness. They did not understand that for him the body was merely a vessel, a tool to be mastered by the will. He had achieved a sovereignty over his own sensations that made the biting frost irrelevant. It was during this campaign that the army witnessed a spectacle even stranger than his resistance to the cold. One morning, something caught his attention. A thought, a logical problem, a snag in the fabric of his reasoning. He stopped moving. He stood there, lost in contemplation. Noon came, and the sun stood high, but Socrates did not move. The soldiers joked about it as they ate their rations. Evening came, bringing the purple shadows of twilight, and still he stood, fixed like a statue in the middle of the camp. The Ionians, curious and bored, brought their sleeping mats out to watch him, wondering if he would stand through the night. The stars wheeled overhead, the constellations shifting their positions in the great dome of the heavens, and Socrates remained immobile, a silent sentinel in the landscape of war. Only when the sun rose the next morning did he move. He offered a prayer to the sun, stretched his stiffened limbs, and walked away as if he had merely paused to tie a sandal. He had spent 24 hours in the absolute stillness of his own mind, while surrounded by the machinery of death. But his stillness was not cowardice. When the battle cry was raised and the phalanxes collided, that terrible crash of wood on bronze, the The shoving match of thousands of men pushing against one another. Socrates was terrifyingly present. The chaos of ancient combat is a blinding, deafening thing. Dust obscures the vision. The screams of the dying drown out orders. In one such skirmish, the Athenian line broke. The retreat was sounding, a chaotic scramble for safety. Alcibiades, the golden youth of Athens, the most beautiful and ambitious man of his generation, fell wounded. He was trapped, surrounded by the enemy, his armor heavy, his blood leaking into the dirt. To leave him was to condemn him to death or capture. While others fled, Socrates stepped forward. He stood over the fallen body of the young aristocrat like a lioness over her cub. He planted his feet, raised his heavy round shield, and held the ground. He fought off the attackers with a calm, methodical ferocity, his eyes wide and scanning, his spear thrusting with precision. He did not fight for glory. He fought for the life of the man beneath him. He saved Alcibiades, and with him, the armor that was the mark of his station. Later, when the generals sought to award the prize of valor, the highest military honor, Socrates sat quietly. The prize should have been his. The whole army had seen what he did. But Alcibiades, grateful and perhaps a little ashamed that he owed his life to this ugly, older man, spoke up for him. Yet Socrates refused. He gestured to Alcibiades, arguing with his characteristic irony that the prize should go to the young nobleman to encourage him in virtue. He gave away the honor as easily as he walked on ice. He had no need for medals. His validation came from within, from that internal demon that guided his steps. He returned to Athens not as a war hero, though he was one, but as a man who had tested his philosophy against the hardest realities of existence. He had looked death in the face and found it less frightening than living a life of ignorance. He hung up his shield, but he did not lay down his fight. He merely changed the battlefield. The discipline of the camp, the ability to endure hardship without complaint, the courage to stand alone when the line breaks. These were the weapons he would now turn against the sloth and arrogance of the city he loved. The soldier had returned, but the war for the soul of Athens had just begun. The silence of the Thracian snows was replaced by the cacophony of the Athenian agora. If the battlefield was a place where bodies collided, the marketplace was a slaughterhouse of ideas. Was here, amidst the stalls selling salted fish from the Black Sea, the fragrant oils from the East, and the noisy debates of the assembly, that Socrates found his true war. He had traded his spear for a question, and his shield for an impenetrable irony. He became a fixture of the city, as permanent and recognizable as the statues of the Hermes that guarded the street corners, though far less silent. The agora was the beating heart of democracy. It was a sprawling, dusty square framed by the stoa, long colonnades that offered shade from the relentless sun. Here, the business of the empire was conducted. Here, men bartered for goods, but they also bartered for influence, for justice, and for truth. Into the swirling tide of humanity walked Socrates, a figure of aggressive ordinariness. He was not a recluse in an ivory tower. He was a street philosopher, a creature of the pavement. He belonged to the public space. He owned no school, charged no fees, and claimed no disciples, yet he was always surrounded. His method was deceptively simple. He would approach a man of reputation, a general, a priest, a politician, or a sophist, and engage him in conversation. It always began with a compliment, a gentle stroke of the ego. He would claim to be confused about a matter of great importance. What is piety? What is courage? What is justice? And ask the expert to enlighten him. The expert, flattered by the attention of this eccentric character, would offer a definition, usually a confident, sweeping statement that reflected the conventional wisdom of the day. Then the dismantling would begin. Socrates would ask a small, seemingly harmless follow-up question. But if that is true, my friend, does it not imply this? The man would agree. Then another question, and another. Slowly, methodically, Socrates would lead the man down a garden path of his own logic until they reached a brick wall of contradiction. The definition would collapse. The expert would find himself admitting the opposite of what he had started with. This was the elenchus, the shame of refutation. It was a public undressing of the mind. The crowds that gathered, mostly young men of the aristocracy, idle and hungry for entertainment, watched with gleeful fascination as their elders were stripped of their intel. Socrates compared his art to that of his mother, Narrated. "I am a midwife," he would say, "but my patients are men, not women, and my concern is not with the body but with the soul that is in labor." He believed that the truth was already inside the person, buried under layers of prejudice, custom, and unexamined opinion. His questions were the pangs of birth, designed to help the individual deliver this truth into the light. But unlike a physical birth, this process was often abortive. Many times, what was delivered was not a healthy child of wisdom, but a wind egg, a phantom belief that had no substance. When Socrates exposed these false beliefs, the parents did not thank him. They felt the sting of humiliation. It was here that the most enduring image of Socrates was forged. He described himself not as a teacher, but as a gift from the god to the city, a gift that the city did not want but desperately needed. "Athens is like a great and noble horse," he said, "which is sluggish because of its size and needs to be aroused by a stinging fly." He was that fly, the gadfly. He buzzed around the flanks of the state, biting, stinging, irritating, never letting the beast settle into the comfortable sleep of complacency. A sleeping horse is safe, but it goes nowhere. A horse stung by a fly might kick, but it is awake. It is alive. The danger of this mission was palpable. In a culture based on shame and honor, where a man's reputation was his life, Socrates was a vandal. He defaced the monuments of male ego. He stopped Euthyphro, a man prosecuting his own father for murder in the name of piety, and showed him he didn't know what piety was. He stopped Laches, a decorated general, and showed him he couldn't define courage. He showed the Democrats that they didn't understand ruling, and the craftsmen that they didn't understand virtue. He was making enemies faster than he was making friends, but he could not stop. To stop would be to disobey the god. The young men who followed him, Plato, Xenophon, Alcibiades, were mesmerized. They saw in him a new kind of heroism. It was not the heroism of Achilles, fueled by rage and violence, but the heroism of the intellect, fueled by a relentless love for the truth. They imitated him. They went home and questioned their fathers, turning the dinner tables of Athens into miniature courtrooms. This generational friction began to heat the atmosphere of the city. The older generation looked at Socrates and saw a corrupter, a Pied Piper leading their sons away from the traditions of the forefathers into a void of skepticism. Yet, amidst the arguments and the logic chopping, there were moments of profound stillness. Socrates would speak of the inner voice, his daimonion, a divine sign that never told him what to do, but only what not to do. It was a check on his actions, a supernatural guide that kept him on the narrow path of his destiny. This voice kept him out of politics, warning him that a just man would not survive long in the political arena of Athens. His politics were of a different order. He was a politician of the soul, legislating the internal constitution of the individual. As the sun set over the agora, casting long shadows from the statues of the tyrants, Socrates would finally turn towards home. He left behind a marketplace littered with broken definitions and confused citizens. He was the most exhausting man in Athens, a relentless force of nature that demanded everyone justify their existence. He walked with a peculiar, rolling gait, his eyes darting, still looking, still hunting. He knew that the stinging fly is often crushed by the tail of the horse, but he also knew that without the fly, the horse eventually dies of its own lethargy. He was willing to be crushed, if it meant the city would open its eyes, even for a moment. The transition from the public square to the private hearth is often a journey from noise to silence, But for Socrates, it was a journey from one storm into another. The city of Athens knew him as the master of logic, the man who could tame the wildest egos with a gentle question. But within the four walls of his own small, mud-brick house in Alapis, the philosopher was stripped of his armor. Here, he was not the intellectual giant of the agora. He was merely a husband who brought home no silver, a father who spent more time with the sons of others than his own, and a man whose head was perpetually in the clouds while the cupboards were often bare. The ruler of this domestic domain was Xantippe. History has been unkind to her, painting her as a shrew, a harpy, a woman whose only purpose was to torment the world's wisest man. But the truth, as always, is woven into the harsh fabric of survival. Xantippe was a woman of Athens, younger than her husband by many years, burdened with the care of 3 small sons. The conflict was inevitable. It was the friction between the ideal and the real. Socrates lived for the eternal. Xantippe lived for the immediate. When he returned home, dusty from the wrestling schools, his mind still vibrating with abstract definitions of justice and goodness, he would be met with the very concrete reality of a leaking roof, a crying child, or an angry wife demanding to know why he had insulted a powerful man who might have helped them. Her voice was a force of nature, a tempest that could rattle the clay pots on the shelves. She would berate him for his laziness, for his endless loitering in the city, for his neglect of his family duties. And Socrates, the man who could dismantle the arguments of the most sophisticated sophists, would stand before her silent and defenseless. He did not argue back. He did not use his dialectic to trap her in a logical contradiction. He simply endured. He treated her outbursts not with anger, but with a detached fascination, as if he were observing a meteorological phenomenon, a sudden squall blowing in from the Aegean. There is a famous moment, etched into the lore of the city, that captures the essence of their union. One afternoon, the arguments had reached a fever pitch. Xantippe's frustration had boiled over, her voice rising in a crescendo of grievances that echoed into the street. Socrates, seeking to escape the sonic assault, retreated to the threshold of the house, sitting on the step to find a moment of peace. But the storm was not over. From the window above, Xantippe, finding her words insufficient to move him, grabbed a chamber pot filled with slop and water. With a final cry of exasperation, she upended the vessel over his head. The water cascaded down the philosopher's face, soaking his tunic, dripping from his beard, and pooling around his bare feet. A lesser man would have exploded in rage. A proud man would have felt the sting of humiliation. But Socrates merely wiped the water from his eyes, looked up at the window where his wife stood panting, and offered a comment of supreme calmness to the bystanders who had gathered to watch the spectacle. "I always said," he murmured, shaking out his cloak, "that after Xantippe's thunder, there would surely be rain." It was a joke, but it was also a philosophy. He did not leave her. He did not divorce her, though it would have been easy for an Athenian man to do so. When asked by his bewildered friend Antisthenes why he, who sought harmony in all things, chose to live with the most difficult woman in Greece, Socrates offered an explanation that transformed his domestic misery into a spiritual exercise. He compared himself to a horse trainer. "Those who wish to become expert horsemen," he said, "do not choose the most docile and gentle horses, but the most spirited and difficult ones. They know that if they can control these, they will easily handle all others." Xantippe was his training ground. She was the whetstone against which he sharpened his patience. If he could keep his temper with her, if he could maintain his equanimity in the face of her fury, then he could face any jury, any mob, any tyrant in the world without fear. She taught him a lesson that the books of Anaxagoras never could. That wisdom is not just about knowing the definitions of virtues, but about practicing them when the cold water is pouring down your back. Yet, beneath the noise and the water, there was a complex bond. Xantippe may have shouted, but she stayed. She raised his children in the shadow of his immense, consuming shadow. And Socrates, in his own strange way, respected the raw authenticity of her emotion. She was the one person in Athens who did not treat him like a god or a genius, but like a man, a flawed, frustrating, impossible man. In the silence that followed the storms, in the quiet moments of the night when the children were asleep, one imagines there was an understanding. She was the anchor that kept him tethered to the earth, preventing him from floating away entirely into the realm of pure thought. She was the reality check, the reminder that even a philosopher must eat, sleep, and endure the messy, loud, chaotic business of being human. Before he was a sculptor of men, Socrates was a sculptor of stone. It is a detail often lost in the bright glare of his philosophy, but it is essential to the architecture of his mind. In the dusty workshop of his father, Socrates, the young Socrates learned the patient, rhythmic violence of the chisel and the mallet. He learned that a statue is not built, it is liberated. The form of the god or the hero is already sleeping inside the rough block of Pentelic marble. The artist's job is not to add, but to subtract, to chip away the excess, the unformed, the false, until only the truth remains. For years, his hands were covered in the white dust of Attica. He carved the three Graces, draped figures that stood at the entrance to the Acropolis, greeting the pilgrims with their silent, stony beauty. But as he worked, a dissatisfaction grew within him, heavier than the rocks he carried. He looked at the marble faces he had smoothed to perfection, and then he looked at the faces of the men walking past the workshop. The statues were beautiful but dead. The men were alive but misshapen by ignorance and vice. He realized that he was wasting his life on the wrong medium. Why spend a lifetime perfecting a stone that will eventually crumble, when one could spend a lifetime perfecting the human soul, which is immortal? He laid down his tools. It was a radical, almost scandalous decision. In a world where a man was defined by his trade and his ability to provide, Socrates chose a life of deliberate idleness. He walked away from the certainty of stone into the uncertainty of words. He traded the visible for the invisible. But he did not leave his father's lessons behind. He simply transposed them. When he questioned a man in the agora, he was still sculpting. He was chipping away the vanity, the prejudice, and the confused beliefs that encased the man's true nature. His questions were the chisel strikes, sharp and precise, knocking off the debris to reveal the rational mind underneath. This transition from marble to word highlighted the great paradox of his existence, the jarring contrast between his outer form and his inner reality. In a city that equated kalos kagathos, the beautiful and the good, Socrates was a walking contradiction. He was grotesque. With his bulging eyes, snub nose, and paunchy belly, he resembled the clay figures of Silenus sold in the statuary shops. Ugly, pot-bellied satyrs associated with drunkenness and excess. To the superficial eye, he was a monster. But those who stopped to listen, those who allowed him to chip away at their defenses, found something radiant hidden within that grotesque casing. Alcibiades, in a drunken moment of candor during a symposium, compared Socrates to those very Silenus statues that were hinged to open up. On the outside, Alcibiades slurred, "He is like the satyr, mocking and lustful. But when you open him up, when you see inside, you find images of the gods so golden, so beautiful, and so amazing that you have to do whatever he commands." This duality became his greatest teaching tool. He used his ugliness as a trap. People would approach him expecting a buffoon, a simpleton they could easily dismiss. They would lower their guard. And then the ugly man would speak with the precision of a mathematician and the depth of a prophet. He would weave a net of words so fine and so strong that the listener would find themselves captured before they realized the trap had sprung. He showed Athens that the body is merely a container, a clay jar that might hold sour wine or sweet honey, and that to judge the contents by the jar is the height of folly. He had become a sculptor of the invisible. He worked without a studio, without patrons, and without end. A statue is finished when the artist puts down the chisel, but a human soul is a work in progress until the moment of death. Socrates understood that the examined life was a process of constant refinement. Every day was a new session in the workshop. Every conversation was an attempt to smooth a rough edge of anger, to polish a dull patch of confusion. He walked the streets not as a beggar, though he looked like one, but as a master craftsman, looking for the raw material of potential in the eyes of the youth, ready to help them carve themselves into something noble, something true, something that would outlast the marble temples on the hill. The end of the Golden Age did not come with a whisper, but with the cacophony of destruction that vibrated through the very bedrock of Attica. The year was 404 before the Common Era, and the long, grinding suicide pact known as the Peloponnesian War had finally reached its grim conclusion. Athens, the queen of the Aegean, the school of Hellas, the city that had dared to dream of empire and eternity, was on her knees. She was starved into submission, her grain routes cut, her navy rotting at the bottom of the Hellespont, her people reduced to skeletons huddling in the shadow of the Acropolis. The surrender was total, and the humiliation was absolute. The defining image of this catastrophe was the demolition of the long walls. These were the massive limestone limbs that connected the heart of the city to the port of Piraeus, the arteries through which the lifeblood of commerce and power had flowed for decades. Now, under the watchful, cold eyes of the Spartan garrison and their triumphant allies, the walls were dismantled. It was a scene of surreal horror masquerading as a celebration. The air was thick with white dust that coated the tongues and eyelashes of the weeping citizens. And through this dust, the sound of flute girls played cheerful, rhythmic melodies. The enemies of Athens danced upon the rubble, proclaiming with every falling stone that liberty had finally returned to Greece. But for the Athenians watching from their windows and their rooftops, it was not liberty that was arriving. It was a darkness more profound than any they had ever known. Democracy, that chaotic, vibrant, dangerous experiment, was extinguished like a candle in a gale. In its place, the Spartans installed a junta of 30 men, Athenian aristocrats who had long despised the rule of the mob. They were known simply as the 30, but history would rightfully brand them as the 30 tyrants. They were men of high birth, cultured education, and icy ruthlessness. Leading them was Critias, a poet, an atheist, and a man of terrifying intellect. He was a relative of Plato, and more damningly, he was a former associate of Socrates. The ghost of this association would haunt the philosopher, a specter that whispered to the public that the monster tearing out the throat of the city had been trained in the art of logic by the son of the stonecutter. Under the 30, Athens was transformed from a bustling metropolis of debate into a silent prison. The transformation was physical and psychological. The Agora, once the loudest place in the Mediterranean, a riot of haggling merchants and arguing philosophers, fell into a deathly hush. The stalls were empty or overturned. The stoas, where Socrates had once cornered generals to ask them about virtue, were now patrolled by whip-carrying attendants of the junta. People walked quickly, eyes fixed on the ground, terrified to greet a neighbor or a friend. For in this new world, a friend could be an informer. The sycophants, professional accusers, roamed the streets, calm. Blood began to flow, not on the battlefield, but in the civic center. The tholos, the round building that served as the dining hall and executive seat of the Senate, became a chamber of terror. Here the 30 sat, drinking wine and signing death warrants with the casual indifference of clerks tallying grain shipments. Hundreds of Democrats were forced to drink hemlock. Others were dragged from their beds in the dead of night, their bodies dumped in shallow graves outside the walls. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia. Every knock on the door, every shadow in the alleyway, every sudden silence in a conversation was a potential harbinger of doom. It was in this climate of suffocating fear that the iron integrity of Socrates was put to its ultimate test. He had spent his life claiming that he knew nothing, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty, that it is better to suffer evil than to commit it. This was not a theoretical classroom puzzle anymore. It was a matter of life and death. The tyrants, in their insidious cleverness, wished to spread the stain of guilt. They did not want to be the only murderers in the city. They wanted to implicate the respected citizens, to dip the hands of honest men in blood so that no one could claim the moral high ground. And so the summons came. It was not a polite invitation. It was a command carried by armed guards. Socrates was ordered to report to the tholos. He walked through the silent streets, his bare feet moving over the familiar stones that were now stained with the invisible residue of betrayal. When he arrived at the round building, he found 4 other citizens waiting. They were men of varying ages and backgrounds, but they shared the same look, the wide-eyed, trembling pallor of men who know they are trapped in a cage with a predator. A representative of the 30, perhaps Critias himself or one of his lieutenants, issued the order. It was brief and brutal. The 5 of them were to proceed immediately to the island of Salamis. There, they were to arrest Leon the Salaminian, a wealthy and respected general of the democracy, a man known for his justice and his service to the state. They were to bring him back to Athens, not for a trial, not for a hearing, but for execution. The purpose was clear: to seize Leon's fortune and to eliminate a potential rallying point for the democratic resistance. The weight of the order hung in the stale air of the tholos. The other 4 men understood the equation perfectly. If they obeyed, they became accomplices to murder, but they would live to see another sunrise. If they refused, they would be accused of treason against the government, and their own bodies would likely be the ones dumped in the pits by evening. It was a choice between the death of the soul and the death of the body. For the 4 others, the choice was terrifying but inevitable. They nodded, their throats too dry to speak. They took their instructions and turned to leave, heading towards the port of Piraeus to find a boat that would take them to Salamis and to their own moral destruction. They moved like sleepwalkers, propelled by the primal instinct to survive at any cost. Socrates stood alone. He did not speak. He did not raise his voice in a dramatic oration about justice. He did not plead with the tyrants or try to use his dialectic to show them the error of their ways. He knew that reason has no power over men who have abandoned their humanity for power. He simply looked at the official, a look of profound, almost pitying calm, and then he turned his back. He walked out of the tholos, but he did not turn towards Piraeus. He did not turn towards Salamis. He turned towards Alapis, towards his home. The separation of the group was a physical manifestation of a spiritual chasm. 4 men went west to kill. 1 man went east to sleep. The walk home was perhaps the longest journey of his life. Every step was a defiance of the most brutal regime Greece had ever seen. He walked past the closed shops, past the temples where the gods seemed to be holding their breath. He knew, with the cold logic that governed his mind, that he was walking towards his death. The 30 did not tolerate disobedience. They had killed men for smiling at the wrong time. They would certainly kill a man who openly flouted their direct command. Yet, as he walked, Socrates felt no panic. He felt the familiar presence of his daimonion, that internal divine sign. It did not warn him to stop. It did not tell him to run and hide. It remained silent, which to him was the greatest comfort. It meant that what he was doing, refusing to participate in a crime, was right. He reached his small, mud-brick house. He likely washed the dust of the city from his feet, ate a meager meal with Xantippe, who perhaps sensed the doom hanging over him, and laid down to rest. He waited for the heavy pounding of the spear butts on his door. He waited for the arrest. He was ready to die rather than drag an innocent man to his execution. But the knock never came. History, which is often a chronicle of tragedies, sometimes pivots on a stroke of blind luck. At that very moment, the foundations of the tyranny were cracking. The exiles, led by the Democrat Thrasybulus, were gathering in the snows of the frontier. A counter-revolution was swelling like a tidal wave. The 30 were suddenly distracted by the need to defend their own lives. In the chaos that followed, the street fighting in Piraeus, the death of Critias in battle, the collapse of the oligarchic regime, the disobedience of the stonecutter was overlooked. Socrates survived. The democracy was restored. The long walls remained in ruins, but the walls of the law were slowly rebuilt. Yet, his survival was a complicated blessing. He had walked through the fire of the tyranny unsinged, his hands clean of blood, but he was now a man marked by everyone. To the remaining oligarchs, he was the man who defied them. To the returning Democrats, he was the teacher of the tyrant Critias, the intellectual father of the monster who had almost destroyed the city. He stood in the middle of a traumatized, vengeful society, a living reminder of the complexities they wanted to forget. He had proven his integrity, but in doing so, he had isolated himself even further. The storm of the tyranny had passed, but it had stripped away the atmosphere, leaving the air thin and brittle, ready to spark at the slightest friction. The old philosopher was alive, but he was now a stranger in a city that was looking for someone to blame for its nightmares. The tyranny had fallen, and the democracy had risen from its grave, but the Athens that emerged from the ashes of the civil war was a city haunted by its own reflection. It was the year 399 before the Common Era. 5 years had passed since the reign of the 30 tyrants, 5 years of uneasy peace held together by a fragile bandage called amnesty. The word itself, amnestia, meant not remembering, a legal decree that forbade citizens from prosecuting crimes committed during the oligarchy. It was a noble attempt to heal a fractured society, to force neighbors who had killed each other's brothers to live side by side once more. But while the laws could command forgetfulness, the human heart possesses a memory that is etched in acid. Beneath the surface of the restored republic, a deep, festering resentment boiled. The city was like a patient recovering from a terrible fever. Weak, irritable, and prone to paranoia, the Athenians looked for the cause of their downfall. Why had the gods abandoned them? Why had they lost the war to Sparta? Why had their own sons turned into the monsters who ran the tyranny? They needed a scapegoat, a vessel into which they could pour all their collective trauma, seal it tight, and cast it out of the city. And wandering through the marketplace, with his bare feet and his annoying questions, was the perfect candidate. Socrates had become a stranger in his own land. He was 70 years old now, a relic of a bygone era. To the new generation of strict Democrats, he was not the harmless eccentric of the past. He was the intellectual father of the catastrophe. Had he not taught Critias, the bloodiest of the tyrants? Had he not been the lover of Alcibiades, the traitor who defected to Sparta? In the eyes of the angry mob, the syllogisms of Socrates had dismantled the moral foundations of the state, creating a vacuum where treachery could flourish. The old man was no longer just a nuisance. He was a symptom of a spiritual disease. The storm clouds gathered not in the heavens, but in the minds of 3 men. They were an unholy trinity representing the 3 classes of citizens Socrates had spent his life humiliating: the poets, the craftsmen, and the orators. First, there was Miletus. He was a young man, unknown and unremarkable, with long, straight hair and a beard that could not hide the weakness of his chin. He was a bad poet, a writer of verses that no one remembered. He represented the vanity of the artists, those men whose pretensions to wisdom Socrates had shredded with his logic. Miletus was the face of the accusation, the puppet whose hand would sign the warrant, driven by a youthful desire for fame and a fanatical, rigid piety. Behind him stood Lyco, the orator, a man of words, a professional speaker who knew how to whip a crowd into a frenzy. He represented the rhetoricians, the class of men who valued persuasion over truth, whom Socrates had exposed as manipulators of the soul. But the true weight, the iron anchor of the prosecution, was Anytus. He was a tanner by trade, a man who smelled of cured leather and wealth. Anytus was a hero of the democratic restoration, a powerful politician who had fought against the tyrants. He was a man of the people, practical, traditional, and deeply suspicious of intellectuals. He hated the sophists, and he lumped Socrates in with them. But his hatred was also personal. His own son had been attracted to Socrates' circle, preferring philosophy to the family business of tanning hides. Anytus saw Socrates not just as a threat to the state, but as a thief who stole children from their fathers. The conspiracy culminated on a spring morning at the royal stoa, the Stoa Basileos. This was the office of the king archon, the magistrate responsible for religious affairs. The location was significant. This was not a matter of civil dispute, but a matter of cosmic order. Miletus, likely trembling with a mix of nerves and adrenaline, walked up to the magistrate and formally posted the indictment. It was written on a wax tablet or a scrap of papyrus, suspended for all to see. The text was brief, but its implications were infinite. Socrates is guilty of crime in refusing to recognize the gods acknowledged by the state and importing strange new divinities of his own. He is further guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded death. The news rippled through the agora like a shockwave. Asabia, impiety. It was the most dangerous charge a man could face. In a city where the favor of Athena protected the walls, to insult the gods was to endanger the entire community. If the gods were angry, they sent plagues, earthquakes, and defeats. By accusing Socrates of atheism and creating new gods, a reference to his mysterious daimonion, his enemies were effectively blaming him for every misfortune that had befallen Athens in the last 30 years. Socrates received the news with the same maddening tranquility with which he accepted a dinner invitation. He was on his way to the king archon's porch when he encountered Euthyphro, a soothsayer who was busy prosecuting his own father for murder. Even in the shadow of his own death trial, Socrates could not resist the urge to philosophize. He engaged Euthyphro in a debate about the nature of piety, exposing the man's ignorance, proving once again that he was incapable of changing his nature. He was a midwife of truth, and he would deliver babies even if the delivery room was a dungeon. But the atmosphere in the city had shifted irrevocably. The wasps of Athens, the old, angry jurors who sat on the benches, were buzzing. They were tired of this man who made them feel stupid. They were tired of his irony. The indictment unleashed a torrent of gossip and slander that had been accumulating for decades. The comic plays of Aristophanes, written 20 years earlier, which depicted Socrates as a floating buffoon who worshipped clouds and taught children to beat their parents, were suddenly being remembered as documentaries. The line between the caricature and the man blurred. Socrates stood accused not just by Miletus, Anytus, and Lyco, but by the shadow of his own reputation. He was facing a trial where the jury would be composed of 501 citizens, men he had likely annoyed, or whose fathers he had annoyed, or whose beliefs he had questioned. The machinery of the Athenian legal system, a beast with 500 heads, began to grind into motion. It was a system designed to crush anomalies, and Socrates was the greatest anomaly the city had ever produced. As the day of the trial approached, the philosopher did not prepare a defense speech. He did not rehearse weeping pleas for mercy. He simply continued to talk, to question, and to live, trusting that a life spent in the service of the god was the only defense he needed. The sun was setting on the age of Pericles, and the long shadows were reaching out to claim the man who had been its conscience. The day of the trial dawned with a heat that promised to stifle the city. It was not the crisp, clean heat of the open fields, but the stagnant, heavy oppression of the courtroom. The Hiliaea, the supreme court of Athens, was not a place of marble grandeur and hushed whispers. It was a vast, open-air enclosure, a wooden pen filled with the smell of sweat, garlic, and cheap wine. On the benches sat the jury, 501 citizens drawn by lot. They were not judges in robes learned in the law. They were cobblers, fishermen, farmers, and rowers from the fleet. They were the demos, the people, irritable from the heat, hungry for drama, and wielding the power of life and death in their calloused hands. Into this arena walked Socrates. He wore the same tunic he had worn every day for decades. He carried no notes. He was accompanied by no weeping wife or children to tug at the heartstrings of the jury, a standard theatrical tactic in Athenian trials. He stood alone on the bema, the speaker's platform, looking out at the sea of faces with a gaze that was neither fearful nor arrogant, but intensely curious. He looked at them not as judges, but as patients in need of a diagnosis. The accusers spoke first. Meletus, trembling with the weight of the moment, spun a web of accusations about corrupted youth and strange gods. He painted Socrates as a dangerous subversive, a man who tore at the fabric of society. The crowd murmured their approval. They wanted a villain, and Meletus gave them one. Then it was Socrates' turn. The water clock, the clepsydra, began to drip, measuring out the limited time of his life. He began to speak, but not in the language of the courts. He did not use the flowery rhetoric of the sophists. He spoke in the rough, simple idiom of the marketplace. I do not know what effect my accusers have had upon you, gentlemen, he began, his voice calm and steady. But for my own part, I almost forgot who I was, so plausibly did they speak. And yet, there is hardly a word of truth in what they have said. For hours he held the court in a strange, suspended state. He did not defend himself so much as he defended his mission. He retold the story of the oracle, explaining that his crime was merely his obedience to the god Apollo. He compared himself to a gadfly sent to sting the sluggish horse of Athens into wakefulness. If you kill me, he warned them, you will not easily find another like me. It was a breathtaking gamble. Instead of flattering the jury, he was lecturing them. He was telling them that they were the ones on trial, not him. He was testing their commitment to justice. The voting began. The jurors rose, filing past the urns to cast their bronze ballots. Solid for innocent, hollow for guilty. The sound of the metal clattering into the jars was the only sound in the vast enclosure. When the votes were tallied, the result was close, far closer than anyone expected. 280 voted guilty. 221 voted innocent. A shift of only 30 votes would have acquitted him. But in the Athenian system, the drama was not over. A guilty verdict required a second phase, the penalty phase. The accusers demanded death. It was now up to Socrates to propose an alternative punishment. If he suggested exile, the jury would likely accept it. If he suggested a heavy fine, his wealthy friends were ready to pay. The court expected him to beg for his life, to offer to leave Athens and never return. Socrates stood up slowly. He looked at the 280 men who had condemned him. He knew that to propose exile would be to admit guilt. It would be a betrayal of his philosophy. To stop questioning would be to stop living. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, he declared. And then he delivered the stroke that sealed his fate. He asked himself what a man who had neglected his own wealth and affairs to serve the city as a moral benefactor deserved. What is a suitable reward for such a poor man? He asked. There is no reward more suitable, gentlemen, than to be fed at the public expense in the Parthenon, along with the Olympic victors. A gasp of disbelief went through the crowd, followed by a roar of outrage. The Parthenon was the sacred dining hall where heroes and visiting dignitaries were feasted. Socrates was not asking for a punishment. He was asking for the highest honor the city could bestow. He was claiming that his philosophizing was more valuable to Athens than the victories of her athletes. It was an act of supreme irony, a final test that the jury failed spectacularly. They saw it as unbearable arrogance. They felt mocked. When the second vote was called to decide between death and the punishment Socrates proposed, the mood had turned vicious. 80 men who had previously voted him innocent now switched sides and voted for death. The final count was overwhelming. The herald announced the sentence, death by hemlock. Socrates did not flinch. He did not pale. While the court dissolved into chaos, he remained the calmest man in Athens. He turned to those who had voted to acquit him, offering them words of comfort. Be of good cheer about death, he told them, and know this of a truth, that no evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death. He looked at the sun setting over the western hills, casting long shadows across the faces of his judges. He had lost the case, but he had won. The argument. He had forced Athens to reveal its true face, to commit a crime that would stain its reputation forever. "The hour of departure has arrived," he said, his voice carrying over the noise of the exiting crowd. "I go to die and you to live. Which of us goes to the better lot is known to no one, except the god." The guards moved in. The chains were brought out. The philosopher, head held high, walked not towards freedom, but towards the prison, leaving behind a city that had just sentenced itself to eternal regret. The fury of the trial had long since subsided, replaced by a strange, suspended silence that hung over the city of Athens like a heavy mist. The verdict had been delivered, the death sentence pronounced with the clattering of bronze ballots in the urns, and the crowds had dispersed to their homes, leaving the agora to the dust and the stray dogs. By all the laws of dramatic tragedy and political expediency, Socrates should have been executed immediately. The sun should have set on his life the very day the judgment was passed, his body growing cold as the evening shadows lengthened across the Nyx. But fate, with its penchant for supreme irony, intervened in the form of a wooden ship, creating an interlude that would become one of the most famous months in the history of human thought. On the day before the trial, the sacred trireme of Athens, the ship known as the Theris, had been garlanded with fresh flowers and dispatched from the harbor of Piraeus to the holy island of Delos. This was no ordinary vessel. Legend held that it was the very same ship sailed by Theseus himself when he traveled to Crete to slay the Minotaur and save the youth of Athens from the labyrinth. In gratitude for that ancient salvation, the city had vowed a yearly pilgrimage to Apollo. It was a time of supreme holiness. By religious law, the city of Athens had to remain ritually pure while the ship was away. No public executions could take place, no blood of the condemned could be spilled, until the vessel returned, its white sails once again visible from Cape Saunion. And so, the winds of the Aegean, usually so predictable in the summer months, turned capricious. They held the ship at sea, delaying its return, granting the condemned philosopher a final, unexpected month of life. It was as if the god Apollo, whose oracle had started this entire tragedy, was now granting his servant a period of grace, a quiet twilight in which to compose his soul before the final darkness. Socrates was confined to the prison of the 11, a modest building located near the bustling marketplace, yet separated from it by an abyss of circumstance. It was not a dungeon of dripping walls and scurrying rats, nor was it a pit of despair. It was a simple set of rooms, guarded by men who, over the course of the month, had grown to love their prisoner. They listened to his talk, they brought him his meals, and they marveled at his lack of fear. For 30 days, Socrates lived here, his ankles loosely bound in iron fetters that chafed the skin but could not bind his spirit. While his friends wept and raged against the injustice, pacing the stone floor like caged animals, Socrates remained the calmest man in the room. He spent his time doing something he had never done before. He wrote poetry. The man who had spent a lifetime dismantling the poets with his logic, who had chased away the muses with his dialectic, now turned to verse in his final hours. He composed a hymn to Apollo and turned the fables of Aesop into meter. When asked why, he explained that a recurring dream had come to him throughout his life, a vision instructing him to make music and work at it. He had always assumed philosophy was the highest form of music, but now, facing the end, he wished to obey the dream literally, just in case he had misunderstood the divine command. He was tidying up his soul, leaving no debt unpaid, no instruction ignored. The climax of this period came in the gray, ambiguous light of the pre-dawn, 2 days before the ship's inevitable return. The world outside was still asleep, the silence of the city broken only by the distant barking of dogs and the rhythmic wash of the sea. Crito, his oldest and most loyal friend, a man of wealth and practical affairs who had known Socrates since they were boys in the Demi of Alopece, arrived at the prison while the stars were still fading. The jailer, who had been bribed long ago by Crito's generous hand, let him in without a word. Crito entered the cell softly, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. He sat by the bed of the sleeping philosopher and watched him. He saw the chest rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect peace. He saw a man who was about to die, sleeping as soundly as a child after a day of play, untroubled by the encroaching shadow of the executioner. Crito could not bring himself to wake him. He sat there for a long time, tormented by his own sleeplessness, his grief, and his frantic plans, marveling at the contrast between his own living hell and the serenity of the man on death row. When Socrates finally opened his eyes, he did not startle. He did not gasp or look around in confusion. He greeted Crito as if they were meeting for a morning walk under the plane trees of the Ilyssus. "Why have you come at this hour, Crito?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep but steady. "It must be quite early." "It is," Crito whispered, his voice trembling. "The dawn is breaking." "I am surprised the keeper of the prison let you in," Socrates remarked, sitting up and rubbing his leg where the iron had left a mark. "He knows me," Crito said dismissively, "and he owes me a favor. But Socrates, I bring bad news. Not bad for you, perhaps, but for me and all of your friends, a calamity we will never recover from. The ship from Delos has been sighted. It will be here today, or surely tomorrow." Socrates nodded, accepting the news as one accepts a change in the weather. "Well, Crito, if it is the will of the gods, so be it." But Crito had no time for resignation. The time for talk was over. The time for action was now. He leaned forward, grabbing Socrates' hand, his eyes wide with urgency. He laid out his plan, a plan that was practical, fully funded, and deceptively simple. The guards had been bribed. The informers had been paid off. A network of friends was ready to whisk Socrates away from Athens. A safe house was waiting in Thessaly, a wild, lawless region to the north where the arm of Athenian justice could not reach. Socrates had only to stand up, walk out the door, and he would be free. "Think of your children," Crito pleaded, his voice cracking. "You are abandoning them, leaving them orphans when you could raise them and educate them. You are taking the easy way out, the cowardly way. And think of us, your friends. People will say that I, Crito, could have saved you if I had only been willing to spend the money, but that I neglected to do so. They will think I valued my gold more than my friend's life. Do not bring this shame upon me, Socrates. The disgrace will be unbearable." It was the argument of the world. Crito pleaded with the desperation of a man losing a part of himself. He appealed to everything that a normal man holds dear: reputation, family, survival, the opinion of the majority. He argued that by staying, Socrates was aiding his enemies, doing exactly what those wicked men wanted him to do. It was a torrent of logic based on the preservation of the body and the ego. It was the voice of the earth, crying out to the man who was looking at the sky. Socrates listened, his face impassive, his large, bulbous eyes taking in the anguish of his friend. He did not interrupt. He let the wave of emotion wash over him, and when Crito had finally exhausted his arguments and sat back, panting in the dim light, the philosopher began to speak. He did not move to put on his sandals. He did not reach for his cloak. Instead, he began to weave one of his last and greatest dialectic arguments. "My dear Crito," he began softly, "your zeal is invaluable if a right one, but if wrong, the greater the zeal, the greater the danger." He began to dismantle Crito's fears, brick by brick. He addressed the fear of public opinion, the many. Why, he asked, should we care what the majority thinks? If a man is training his body, Does he listen to the praise and blame of every person in the crowd? Or does he listen only to the one man who is a doctor or a trainer? If he listens to the ignorant mob, he will ruin his body. And is not the soul more precious than the body? If we listen to the mob regarding justice and injustice, will we not maim and destroy that part of ourselves which is improved by justice and ruined by injustice? We must value not living, Socrates declared, the central tenet of his life shining through the gloom of the cell, but living well, and to live well meant to live honorably, justly, and in accordance with the truth. Then, to answer Crito's plea to escape, Socrates did something extraordinary. He conjured a presence that filled the small room, a presence more terrifying and majestic than any executioner. He personified the laws of Athens. He imagined them standing before him and Crito, shadowy and immense figures, demanding an accounting of his soul. Tell us, Socrates. The laws seemed to speak through his lips, their voice resonating with the weight of centuries. What do you intend to do? Do you not intend by this action of escaping to destroy us? Can a state subsist and not be overthrown, in which the decisions of law have no power, but are set aside and trampled upon by individuals? Through this imagined dialogue, Socrates demonstrated the social contract that bound him. The laws had married his parents, Sophroniscus and Phaenarete. The laws had overseen his birth. The laws had educated him in music and gymnastics. The laws had protected him for 70 years. He had walked the streets of Athens as a free citizen, accepting the benefits of the city. He had fought in her wars at Potidaea, Amphipolis, and Delium. He had voted in her assemblies. He had raised his children under her protection. He had never chosen to leave, though the gates were always open to any citizen who wished to take his property and go elsewhere. He had ratified the contract with his deeds, day after day, for 7 decades. You have been more constant to us than any other Athenian, the laws argued. You never left the city for a festival except once to the isthmus. You never traveled. You were content with us and our city. And now, because we have judged you, perhaps wrongly, but through the proper channels, will you turn around and destroy us? Will you return evil for evil? A child does not strike his father back because his father punishes him. A citizen does not dismantle the state because the state has erred. He pictured his life in exile as the laws mocked the very idea. In Thessaly, among the barbarians and the disorder, he would have to live as a sycophant, telling jokes to amuse the local warlords, known forever as the old man who clung to life so desperately that he crawled out of Athens in a disguise, perhaps wrapped in a shepherd's cloak, fleeing death when he had so little life left anyway. What value would his philosophy have then? Who would listen to a man speak of virtue when his final act was a betrayal of his own city? How could he talk of justice when he had fled from it? Listen to us, Socrates, the laws concluded, and not to Crito. Think not of life and children first, and of justice afterwards, but of justice first, that you may be justified before the princes of the world below. For neither will you nor any that belong to you be happier or holier or juster in this life, or happier in another, if you do as Crito bids. The voice of the laws faded, leaving a ringing silence in the cell. Crito's arguments had crumbled into dust. The practical escape plan, so solid, so expensive, so logical to the worldly mind, dissolved under the acid of Socratic ethics. The silence that filled the room now was not the silence of waiting, but the silence of resolution. Socrates had found a freedom that Crito could not understand. He was physically trapped within 4 walls, his death approaching with the speed of a returning ship, yet he was the only free man in the room. He was free from the fear of death, for he knew that no evil can happen to a good man. He was free from the tyranny of public opinion, for he answered only to the truth. He was free from the instinct to survive at the cost of his soul. He had realized that the walls of the prison were made of stone, but the walls of the law were made of spirit, and to break the latter was the only true imprisonment. "My dear Crito," Socrates said gently, looking at his weeping friend with infinite compassion. "This is what I seem to hear, just as the Carabants seem to hear the music of flutes in their trance. The sound of these arguments rings in my ears and makes it impossible for me to hear anything else. Let us then follow the path that the god has pointed out." He had chosen to stay. He had chosen to die as an Athenian, obedient to the city that was killing him, turning his execution into a final act of civic loyalty. As the sun rose higher, casting a bar of bright, dusty light across the stone floor, the fetters on his legs seemed to lose their weight. He was not a prisoner waiting for the end. He was a sentry remaining at his post until the commander relieved him. The cell was no longer a cage. It was the antechamber to eternity, and he sat within it, waiting for the ship, waiting for the poison, waiting for the god, with a smile of perfect, terrifying peace. The ship from Delos had returned. Its white sails, visible from the temple of Poseidon at Saunion, had signaled the end of the holy truce. The reprieve was over. The city of Athens, having purified itself for the god Apollo, was now ready to stain itself with the blood of its wisest citizen. The day of the execution had arrived, bringing with it a sky of piercing, relentless blue, the kind of Athenian sky that seems to mock human tragedy with its indifference. Inside the prison, the mood was not one of terror, but of a strange, disjointed sorrow. The chains that had bound Socrates' legs for a month had been removed by the 11, the magistrates responsible for the prison. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his calves to restore the circulation, marveling at the strange relationship between pain and pleasure. "How singular is the thing called pleasure," he mused to the friends who had gathered around him, "and how curiously related to pain, which might be thought to be the opposite of it, because they will never be present to a man both at the same time, and yet if anyone pursues and attains the one, he is almost compelled to take the other." Even in his final hours, rubbing the sore spots on his legs, he could not help but analyze the human condition. The cell was crowded. It was a gathering of the faithful, a final seminar in the shadow of the grave. Crito was there, his face lined with sleepless grief. Phaedo, the young nobleman who would later recount this day to the world, sat close by. Antisthenes, Apollodorus, and others were present. Plato, notably, was absent. He was ill, perhaps overcome by the sheer weight of the impending loss. Xanthippe had been there earlier, holding their youngest child in her arms. She had wept uncontrollably, crying out the words that cut to the bone. "Oh, Socrates, this is the last time your friends will speak to you and you to them." Seeing her distress, Socrates had gently asked Crito to have someone escort her home, sparing her the spectacle of the end. He wanted the atmosphere to be one of tranquility, not hysteria. For the rest of the day, while the sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent towards the mountains of Salamis, Socrates engaged his friends in one last, great dialogue. The topic, fittingly, was the immortality of the soul. He spoke not as a man condemning his judges, nor as a victim railing against fate, but as a traveler packing his bags for a journey to a better country. He compared himself to a swan. "Swans," he said, "when they perceive that they must die, having sung all their life long, do then sing more lustily than ever, rejoicing in the thought that they are about to go away to the god whose ministers they are." He insisted that he was the fellow servant of the swans, consecrated to the same god, and that he should not leave this life with less grace than a bird. He argued that the true philosopher spends his entire life practicing for death. For what is philosophy if not the separation of the soul from the distraction of the body? If the body is a cage that confuses the mind with hunger, thirst, lust, and fear, then death is merely the breaking of the lock. Why then, he asked, should a man who has spent his life trying to free his mind be afraid when the freedom is finally offered? The shadows grew long. The golden light of the late afternoon began to paint the stone floor of the cell. In Athens, the law dictated that the execution must take place at sunset. The moment was approaching. Socrates rose and went into a side room to bathe, wishing to save the women the trouble of washing a corpse. When he returned, fresh and clean, the sun was touching the peaks of the western hills. The jailer entered. He was a simple slave of the state, a man who had seen many executions, but he was weeping. He stood before Socrates and spoke with a trembling voice. "Socrates," he said, "I have known you to be the noblest and gentlest and best of all who ever came to this place. I know you will not be angry with me, for you know who are the guilty causes of this, and not I." Bursting into tears, the man turned away and went out to prepare the poison. Socrates looked after him with genuine affection. "Farewell," he called out, "and I will do as you bid." He turned to Crito. "How charming the man is! Since I have been in prison, he has always been coming to see me, and how generously he weeps for me." Crito, desperate to steal a few more moments, pointed out that the sun was not yet completely set. "There is still time," he pleaded. "Others wait until late after the order is given, eating and drinking. Do not hurry." Socrates smiled, a smile of infinite patience. "I do not think that I should gain anything by drinking the poison a little later, but my own contempt for clinging to life when there is no longer anything left of it." The cup was brought. It contained a dark, murky liquid, hemlock, conium maculatum. The executioner explained the procedure with clinical detachment. "Drink it, then walk around until the legs feel heavy, then lie down and the poison will do the rest." Socrates took the cup. His hand did not tremble. His color did not change. He looked at the executioner with his famous, bull-like gaze and asked, "What do you say about making a libation out of this cup to some god? Is it allowed?" The man replied that they only prepared the exact amount needed for death. "I understand," Socrates said, "but I may and must pray to the gods to prosper my journey from this to that other world." He raised the cup to his lips and drank it, calmly, easily, as if it were a cup of wine at a symposium. Until that moment, his friends had managed to hold back their tears, but seeing him drink the poison, the dam broke. Apollodorus began to howl with grief. Crito rose and turned away to hide his face. Phaedo covered his head and wept. The room was filled with the sound of heartbroken sobbing. Socrates lowered the empty cup. "What is this strange outcry?" he asked, his voice stern. "I sent away the women mainly in order that they might not offend in this way, for I have heard that a man should die in peace. Be quiet and have patience." Shamed by his words, the friends controlled their grief. The room fell silent again. Socrates began to walk about the cell as instructed. The poison, a creeping coldness, began to work its way through his system. He walked until his legs felt heavy, and then he laid himself down on his back upon the bed. The executioner approached and pressed his foot hard. "Do you feel that?" he asked.
"No," Socrates replied.
The numbness was ascending. The cold moved from his feet to his calves, then to his thighs. He touched himself and said that when the poison reached his heart, he would be gone. The cold reached his abdomen. He uncovered his face, which he had covered with a cloth, and spoke his final words. They were not a grand philosophical statement, nor a curse upon Athens. They were a simple instruction, cryptic and profound. "Crito," he whispered, his voice weak but clear, "we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it." Asclepius was the god of healing. It was customary to sacrifice a rooster to him upon recovering from an illness. With his dying breath, Socrates was saying that life, with its confusion and physical limitations, was the sickness, and death was the cure. He was not dying, he was healing. Crito, weeping, leaned close. "It shall be done," he promised. "Is there anything else?" There was no answer. A moment later, a slight movement passed through his body. The executioner uncovered him. The eyes were fixed in a stare that looked beyond the stone walls, beyond Athens, beyond the veil of the physical world. Crito reached out and closed his mouth and his eyes. So died Socrates. The sun had set, but a light had been kindled that no poison could extinguish. The gadfly was dead, but the horse of Athens, and the mind of humanity, would never sleep so soundly again.